Disclaimer: the views expressed on this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek are solely the opinions of the host and the guest. The content of the conversation is not reflective of the institutions or establishments mentioned therein. Take all these opinions with a pinch of salt and a dash of lime if needed. Namaskara, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching or listening, and welcome to this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek. This episode features Caleb Williams, who is one of the people of many people that I've had on the podcast from the University of Central Oklahoma. And in this episode, we spoke about mostly his endeavors of teaching after graduating from college, to where he's teaching high school students, and some of the nuances associated with that. And we also spoke about his relationship with Han Setlu, who was also another UCO student while I was at UCO. I don't know why I'm making this so convoluted. I'm trying to make use of different words at each time, I guess. But anyway, that's besides the point. Um, Caleb spoke about his relationship with Han and some of the subtleties and nuances that he learned about the difference in cultures. Now, you probably have also noticed that I haven't been doing a lot of these intros on the podcast episodes. But the reason why I'm doing it for this one is because the Zoom recording failed to record my video. So you can still hear me, but you unfortunately can't see this pretty face. I'm just kidding. Anyway, you will get to hear the great conversation that I had with Caleb, though. Um, so I just want to say thank you for being a part of all of this, even through all these hiccups that seem to be popping up. But I suppose that's part of the journey. But yeah, thank you so much. And without further ado, here's Caleb Williams and myself having another great conversation. Hey Caleb, how's it going?
Pretty good. Pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Thank you for asking, and thank you for joining me. But yeah, before we get
Yeah.
started, if you could let everybody know who you are, what you do, any likes and dislikes in everyday life, future aspirations, the whole spiel, but whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Caleb Williams. And Prateek and I know each other from university and so involved with the international students and things like that at university. Now I'm graduated and I am an English language arts teacher. And I am in a city near Dallas, Texas at a high school. So I teach freshmen, which is pretty fun. This is my first semester teaching, so it's been a pretty good learning experience so far. Um, let's see, likes, dislikes, future aspirations. Um, well, I really like living in Texas so far. I moved from Oklahoma to Texas. I'm originally from Oklahoma. And then dislikes, I don't like Texas drivers. They are a little crazy. Um, and then I will say future aspirations. I plan on doing a master's degree in France sometime in the next, 5 years or so. So that's something I'm kind of looking forward to in the future. So yeah.
Cool, cool. What made you want to go into the field of teaching?
So I had when I first started university, I was a biology major. I was not really teaching wasn't even like on my mind at all. And after one semester, I liked it and I like science. However, I decided that I wanted to travel and I wanted to maybe live abroad for a little while. And my plan with biology was to go into dentistry. I wanted to be a dentist, but it was like 8 years of schooling. And then once you're a dentist, you kind of have your set clientele base and you kind of are based in one area and you stay there for like a long term career. So I figured it wasn't really something I wanted to do with my career long term, even though I did really like science. So I started looking into, I guess, jobs where I could travel a little bit, and teaching English abroad was something that I came across. And I had found I was like, you can kind of teach English abroad even if you don't have a university degree, but I had found that if you do have a university degree, you can get jobs in countries that pay a little bit better or that are more competitive for that market. So I went instead of doing ESL, like which is teaching English as a second language, I chose to do teaching English just so I could be certified to teach at a high school here, just in case something happened with my family at home or something and I ever had to move back, I would be able to um, teach here at kind of a high school. And so it was never my intention to go into teaching at a high school. My intention was always to teach abroad. And so how did I end up in Texas teaching at a high school? So my boyfriend Han is from Myanmar, and so we were going to go to his country after we both graduated, and I was going to teach English there. But there's been a lot of political instability, and it's not very safe, and the economy and all of that stuff is kind of really not so great right now. So we decided to move to Texas for a couple of years, teach here, save up some money, and then kind of explore our options from there to give ourselves a little more time with that. So
Yeah, I remember talking to Han about that. Like, it's probably a good year back. Yeah, and it's kind of unfortunate that things haven't changed for the better, but hopefully they do.
yeah.
From a from a more sort of personal sense of making that decision to switch from biology to now teach, was that decision a hard decision to make for you, or was it much
Um,
easier than you thought it would be?
the only thing that was hard for me personally, I knew that I would enjoy, you know, the traveling aspect and teaching English. And I love English. Like always did really well in English in school. And so that aspect of it wasn't hard for me. The harder part was being a little more concerned about like, job security and finance, like going from like, I'm going to be a dentist, which is like a doctor, which makes pretty decent money, to going to like an English teacher. Like that's a pretty big career trajectory shift. So I was, because when I was going to be a dentist, my parents would kind of joke about like how I was going to take care of them when they were old and stuff. So that aspect of it was a little bit harder, but I knew that it was something that I wanted to do. And I thought, I'd rather have a lifetime of like knowing this is what I want to do rather than like job security and financial security. So it was kind of a risk I thought was worth taking. So I think that was probably the hardest part of it. But overall, I knew it was the right thing for me to do. So
Mm. Was it hard having that conversation with your parents? I mean, you can share what you're comfortable sharing, but I'm just curious to know.
not really. I think it benefited me to have American parents who are, more like, "Oh, you do what you wanna do and be happy," and that kind of thing. Because after, talking with Han, his parents, when because he was originally in medical school, so when he switched, it was, like, a huge thing. But for my parents, they were like, "Well, if that's what you really wanna do, like, that's fine, like, you should go ahead and do it." And my mom actually kind of encouraged me to change my major from biology to English ed, so it wasn't necessarily hard for because they supported me in it, but like I was more hard on myself as in like I kind of they didn't tell me that they what their expectations were, but I kind of like knew that if I did change, it might change the way that they saw their future a little bit. So it was more me being hard on myself rather than them any pressure from them. So I didn't really I guess I was blessed in that sense to have that transition be pretty easy on their side of things. So
Oh, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Yeah, because I mean, like you said, right? It's um some s- we tend to inflict that on ourselves in more cases. Because sometimes when you like actually try and sit down and explain to your parents why things might work out or why you want to do this, I mean, of course, I'm only speaking from my personal experience and based off of what you just said. Things can work out, but then again, everybody has their own sort of financial situations, which also motivate decisions. So
mhm,
that's sort of like also an understanding that I think we need to have, because I feel like it's very easy to tell someone to choose what you want to do and be happy and all that sort of stuff, but then we necessarily don't have the context to why did they choose to do that and
mhm.
what their background is and so on and so forth. So it's interesting how the mind works in that way. But transitioning over to you teaching in a high school now, does it help that the age gap is a lot shorter than it usually is for
I
teachers
think
and students?
I think so. Like sometimes the things my students like tell me, I'm like, maybe you shouldn't like tell a teacher that kind of like, or I don't know, just they just see me a little bit differently than they see. I mean, they still see me as older, which was like kind of interesting because like I don't see myself as that much older than them, but they do see me as a little bit older. But they definitely, I think, whether consciously or subconsciously, they understand that there is an age difference between me and some of their other teachers. So the conversations that they have with me sometimes are conversations that I can tell that they have never talked to a teacher about, or that they didn't expect the teacher would know about that subject, or that song that they've been listening to, or that TikTok trend, or like things like that. So it's been interesting. When I did my internship, my student teaching internship last semester before I graduated, to get certified, I was with high school seniors. So they were a lot closer in age to me, than my freshman students are now. So that's part of the reason why I chose freshmen, so that there would be a little bit more of a age difference, because that age difference does help keeping control of the classroom, and they respect you a little bit more if they feel like you're not their friend, like you're their friend, but not like there's a line, you know what I mean? And so it's been interesting. It's been a learning experience for sure. I do feel a lot older being around 14 and 15-year-olds now. Like I don't know, you just see yourself differently. It's like, oh wow, was I really that way when I was 14, 15? Like, and we all were. So it's just funny to see the difference, and how much like I have grown personally in the past, like, almost 10 years or so since I was a freshman in high school. So it's been interesting. I really enjoy it so far. So
What's the sort of major difference you noticed from teaching high school seniors to high school freshmen, like in the way that they approach things?
well, okay, so there are two factors that I would say influence the way that my freshmen behave and the way that my seniors behave. When I was with seniors, I was in kind of like a suburban school. Edmond, it's a little bit wealthier community, more parental involvement. The students don't have to. There's like less pressure on the students to like, financially, I guess. Whereas the school I'm at now, it's a little bit more economically diverse. It's also a lot more racially diverse as well. You have so many different students from all different kinds of backgrounds. And so I would say for sure between the seniors and the freshmen, the one thing that's like the same is the fact that they all like think it's okay to like just turn in homework late. And I think that's a result of like the pandemic over the past couple of years. There's been like a lot of leniency. So that's one thing that I have noticed between the two that's the same, that didn't really change, but like behaviorally they are very different. Like the seniors, they were a lot more sophisticated, I guess, in their sense of humor, and um, they had their interests a little more defined, and they weren't so self-conscious. And like the freshmen that I have, they are so like they're brutal to each other. They'll just like roast each other over the smallest things, and they're all like embarrassed and self-conscious. And um, sometimes they smell bad too, which which is funny. But I would say I liked teaching seniors, but I think that I won't go back to teaching seniors until I have a little more age and a little more experience, because I when I did my internship, I had a mentor teacher in the classroom with me the whole semester, and now I'm in the classroom by myself. So having seniors with a mentor teacher, they did respect me a little bit, just because they also had a like not real teacher, but like the main teacher in the classroom. She was there to kind of support me and have my back. So I think that that experience with the seniors would have gone a little differently had I not had that factor there. So, but I would say probably the bigger difference that I've noticed is the parental involvement between like from like more economically privileged students. The parents are a lot more involved because maybe there's two parents in the home, or um, with my students now, the freshmen, a lot of them come from like single parent homes, and they've got a lot of siblings, and so I just never hear from the parents at all. Like if the student's failing the class, like it's like I don't know. It's just crazy to see how little parental involvement they do get. And I think that does affect their behavior, because when parent expectations at home are lined up with expectations at school, it's easier for them to maintain some normalcy. But like if the expectations at school are completely different than at home, it's they don't really take the expectations at school as seriously, I think. So I think that that's a big difference, and that's something that I've kind of had to adjust to, and to learn how to hold them accountable to their grades and like their success, and to, I guess, teach them that they can work hard and they can be successful, and that there are consequences if they don't, you know, do their homework, or if they just don't care, if they sit on their phone the whole time in class, things like that. So it's just been interesting to learn how to deal with those two different groups of students has been like very, very different. So it's been a learning experience for sure. So,
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, it's quite fascinating to sort of look at that aspect of parental influence and how that might help or demotivate kids from performing in
mhm.
school. Um, but have you seen any instances so far to where you feel like there's too much parental involvement?
So not this semester with my freshmen, because the parental involvement has been so low. I've only probably talked to four parents, maybe out of 130 students. Four parents is not a lot for this whole
Right.
semester so far. Last semester, though, there was an instance where there was too much parental involvement. Like this student, um, she was falling behind in her work, and she would turn in work late, and it would affect her grade because you take off points if their work is so late. So she was already not doing well. Well, the way that my internship worked is, for the semester I would like co-teach with the teacher, and then for 4 weeks she kind of gave the class over to me for a unit, and she said, okay, you can design the whole unit, design the activities, do all the grading, do all the parental communications, all of that. So before this 4 week period that I was in control of the classroom, she was already not doing well. But then her dad noticed during my 4 weeks that she was not doing well. So he emailed, um, basically, he emailed my mentor teacher's email, and she had me respond from her email account, and I like signed off my name and stuff. And I kind of explained that she was missing a couple assignments. If she turned those in, her grade would come up a little bit, but she needs to focus on getting assignments in on time. And it was like very polite and very nice. And then I never heard back from him. And I was like, oh, that's weird. And then next thing I know, the principal's like contacting us. And this guy has gone straight to the principal. He was like blaming my mentor teacher and saying that she was like avoiding her responsibilities by having me respond instead of her. And like he called the principal, he called the curriculum development uh, coordinator at the school, he called her academic advisor, he called his ex-wife and had his ex-wife like on the phone, and she clearly did not want to be there. The daughter was in the meeting, I was there, my mentor teacher was there. It was like a whole thing, and he was just kind of like berating us about his daughter's grade, and like how his daughter has never done well in English, and this is the first time that she's done well, and they're trying to get scholarships, and it was like a whole thing. And at one point in the meeting, he kind of we were trying to explain to him that she was already not doing well before my unit, because he thought that it was my fault that she wasn't doing well, that I was like a new teacher. um, and so at one point he said that he originally was uh, had studied education. And he said that when he got to the student teaching internship phase, the phase that I was in at the time, he was like, I realized it wasn't for me. And he kind of like looked at me like that, as in like, maybe this isn't your thing. And I was like, oh my gosh. Like, so after that meeting, I was like a little shaken. I was like, this is like my first time actually teaching and having control of the classroom. And like a parent kind of goes crazy on me. So that was probably an instance of a little where it was over the top, where it's like nothing was the student's fault. It was all the teacher's fault. Like, and I think that that's something that I learned, is that like, I mean, parents love their kids, obviously. And if they want their kid to succeed, sometimes that can blind a parent to maybe the faults that their child has, or maybe the path or the things that their child might need to work on to be successful in that particular class. So that was a learning experience for sure. And I'm glad that I had it my first semester, when I had a mentor teacher there to support me and to kind of show me how that process works, and to kind of have my back, and reassure me that like, no, this isn't your fault. Like, that student was already doing poorly before your unit. And so that was, I guess the timing of it ended up being um, good for me to learn from that experience. So yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating how, I think sometimes maybe in that sense of, I mean, I can't speak for a parent because I'm not a parent, but
Yeah.
um, it it's sort of interesting how that level of accountability is very different. Like they see
Hmm.
that the teacher should be more accountable than the student should. While I think while you're in high school, I think you do have some sensibilities to know what accountability is.
Hmm.
So it's interesting to sort of look at it from that perspective. And so for you, like from noticing the kids that you're working with, I mean, we're not that different from each other. We're like older than each other, but I don't know why I'm calling them kids. Anyway, from the students that you're working with, like how are you sort of seeing that level of accountability that they have as students in the class?
So with the current students that I have, the last time that they had a normal year of school pre-pandemic, I think they were in like fifth or sixth grade, which is like
Mm,
insane that their entire middle school experience was basically like pandemic school, which was like partly online, due dates extended. Like, the goal was to get them through the year to make sure that, if they learned at least something, they were good. Like the expectations were lowered a lot because, it was a tough time for parents and students. And um, so because of that, I think a lot of that accountability and a lot of that where students learn how to be accountable for their own learning and their own progress, a lot of that happens in middle school. That shift from elementary school, everything's kind of given to them. They're given these worksheets they need to do, they do them in class. It's like everything is kind of handed to them. The expectations are set, and they they don't really take control of their own learning. Middle school is like kind of the transition to where, like, in high school they start picking their classes they take, and they have to have so many credits to graduate. And um, so for them to have kind of missed a lot of that learning phase where they're learning to take control of their own path and their own education, it has been interesting. I think the level of self accountability is a lot lower, and this is something I'm hearing from a lot of the other teachers too, um, at the school, because like I've talked to some of them and they said that this year has been really tough with the freshmen, especially because they just don't know what the expectations are, and they're having to learn that and get caught up in, one year what they should have kind of been practicing over 3 years in middle school. So um, they don't really have much self accountability, which it makes me sad for them, because I know that without that self accountability, like, they won't be able to be successful at the things that they want to be successful at. And so that's something I'm really trying to like, not even like focusing on grades and stuff like that. Like, those things are important, but like, just what I want my students for this semester to learn is that self accountability and how to kind of be motivated to take control of their own learning path, and how they're gonna, like, what they're interested in and who they are as a person, and what their goals that they want to achieve are, and how they can get there. Like, because I mean, if left to it, they would just sit on TikTok for 8 hours a day and not even. I'm like, they're not going to get anywhere if they're doing that. And I want them to be successful. And I know they have interests, and I know that they have skills and talents that they would be, happy to learn to use and to be successful at. And so to teach them how, I guess, they can be successful at that, they just maybe have to put down the phone and, and, develop some of their skills a little bit. I think that that's been my big focus for this semester, because that accountability, self accountability, just isn't there from what I can see. Um, so yeah, I mean, that was kind of a long answer, but that's kind of where I see that they are. And yeah, I don't know. You just grow to care for your students a little bit. At first, they were kind of a little annoying with their lack of self accountability, but it quickly became something that I was like, okay, like, I really care about them and I want them to be able to be successful. So,
right, right, right. Yeah, that's very interesting how the pandemic seems to have affected that um to such a level to where, I mean, I can understand, because I think when you're of that age, your brain is still growing. Your brain is not completely grown. So you're used to one thing, and then 3 years later you're being told to sort of switch it up all again. And it becomes a lot harder for them to transition, I suppose, and sort of make those changes that they need to. But I was just curious, like, how are you implementing, or what are you doing to maybe help them with that self accountability? And is it more so like looking at it from the sense of, okay, make sure that you're submitting your things on time and all that, or is it more like talking to them about it?
A little bit of both. There have been times where so, like, one thing some of the other teachers do is they have, like, a really strict, harsh phone policy, and it's like students can't pull their phone out at all, like, and I have tried to take a little bit of a different approach because it's kind of a constant battle, like, they cannot go a full class period without their phone, like, they're I don't know, it's like they feel like they're missing a part of them if they don't have access to their phone. So what I have tried to do is be a little more lax on it. But there are days that we do need to like, okay, we have an activity today and it's going to take the whole class period. Like you need to be focused on what we're doing to get it done. And those are days that I will talk to them and I say, okay, like I mean, if you're going to be on your phone today in the grade book, I'm going to put a note on this assignment that you were on your phone during class period when I gave you time to work on this. And I'll sit down and talk with them about that. And I was like, okay, so like, I'm okay if you sit here on your phone, but that means that you're going to have to do this project at home and you're going to have to turn it in at home. And like, I think that sometimes they think that they can just like, if they don't get it done, they can, eventually when it comes time to submit the grades and stuff for the quarter, they'll be like, oh, like, is there any makeup work I can do? Like, it's like I don't necessarily, and I've been telling them, I'm like, I'm not gonna have makeup work that you can do. Like, you can do the work that we're doing. I'm not gonna do extra grading and come up with extra assignments and stuff just for you so you could be on your phone this day. And like having conversations like that with them is, I think it's been interesting because at first, before like they were kind of testing the waters to see like, was I gonna be serious about this? Like, and when the end of the quarter came, quite a few of them did end up failing the quarter. And I think that they didn't expect that because in middle school, they were kind of passed along just to kind of move them along through the pandemic and get them through this. And so this quarter, I have noticed they will, like when we get started on assignment, they will, sometimes some of them will pull out their phone for like 10 minutes or whatever. But then like, I'll go around the room and I'll be like, okay, like if you're going to get this done in class, you're going to have to get started on it. It's like now, otherwise you're not going to have time to finish before class ends. And I have noticed a lot more of them will, when it comes time to it, they will put their phones away and they will start. Um, so that's been interesting. I don't know if it's foolproof. Like, I mean, a lot of students, they won't, and they'll just be on their phone the entire class period. I'm like, okay, 0 in the grade book, like, not my problem. And I don't know, it's just been interesting to try and have little conversations with them like that because some of them, like one student, his parent actually contacted me. This is one of the 4 parents that contacted me. And I told her, I was like, well, I mean, when I give them class time, he's usually on his phone or he's talking to his neighbor or and so that was interesting because I didn't hear back from her like after that conversation and the problem kind of persisted. So I think that she was just calling me to like try to get his grade up without him changing any of his behavior because like his behavior didn't really change and I didn't hear back from her after that. And so that's when I realized that the accountability was not going to come from the parent. Like the parents were not going to be, or at least with this set of kids that I have, I could not expect the parents to be an ally in teaching that kind of accountability. So um, I don't know, just like little things, little conversations here and there. Like if I see a student on their phone too much, I'm like, okay, you're going to have to do this at home and you're going to be behind because we're starting something on, our next class that we have tomorrow, we're going to be starting something new and you're not going to be able to work on this tomorrow. So, I mean, are you going to be able to get that done at home? And a big thing that I've been telling them is like, if you get your stuff done in class, if you have questions about it, you can ask me while I'm here. Like if you wait till midnight tonight, I'm going to be asleep and I'm not going to be able to help you with it. So you're going to be on your own with it. Um, that has motivated some students too. I think they just don't think about these things. I mean, if TikTok's right there and their friend's sending them a meme or something, like that doesn't really enter their mind. So you kind of have to help them think about what are the consequences. because I think that so far, at least through middle school, there weren't many consequences, so that it doesn't come naturally to their mind to think about those things in the future. Um, so just trying to get them to think about the future, I guess, is one of the methods I've been trying to use to help them learn accountability. So,
Gotcha. It's yeah, like and when you sort of explain that in terms of how there's a level of accountability, or well, more so in the sense that parents are not necessarily in this situation, unfortunately, allies in that they can't necessarily help you in that case, which I think it's not that we don't speak about this, but then I don't think we speak about this enough in terms of how important it is to have that backing from home. Now, I do
mhm,
understand that we don't know, like some of these parents are probably going through shit that is
yeah,
unimaginable,
yeah,
so for them, like just giving away the phone to their child and letting them just sort of get
hmm
by is the best that they can do. And I mean, it's
hmm
sad that that's the case, but how important do you think it is for us to realize that these small things that we might or might not do at home um, are really important? And the reason I ask that is because I mean, I don't know about yourself and Han, but for me personally, I do see myself having kids, and that's something that I do think about in terms of how I will help them learn and things like that. So, like, if you've thought about this, or if you're comfortable sharing, like, how do you look at that in terms of making sure that the kids should be able to learn from home and so on?
um, it is tough because, like you said, like the parents, I mean, there are a lot of times they're going through a lot. Maybe they have 5 kids and it's a single mom who has to work 40 hours a week. Like, there's no way that she could possibly be giving the level of support that, and it's not her fault necessarily. Like, there are situations that are outside of our control. Um, and honestly, some of these kids, like, maybe school wasn't a priority for their parents when their parents were in school. So it's the parents don't realize how much of a priority it should be for their own kids. Like, they got by without school being a priority. So maybe, I don't know, it just, there is a level of like, I think a lot of times, like, parents get so busy, sometimes, like, phones and the internet and stuff become like kind of a babysitting device, which is something that, like, my dad, his mom was a single mom, and like the TV, like when they would get home from school, she would just turn on the TV for them, and they would just like literally, my dad said he watched so much TV growing up because it was the babysitter for him and his sister. And because my grandma would have to work all the time and she was a single mom with 2 kids. And so, like, I mean, those situations are tough. And I don't think that I have found, like, I don't know what the answer to that is. I do know that I can try to support the kids as best I can at school. But what I'm also discovering is that just having support at school is oftentimes not enough. So I don't know. It's a tough problem that I don't think I fully have um, an answer to. And I think that, I mean, I think that in some cases, a lot more, um, I don't know, like, I think that maybe I just say this because I'm a teacher, but I think that in some ways, like, more government family support might be beneficial. But then again, I've never been in that situation and I don't know, like, I don't know enough about it to say what the answer would be in those kinds of cases. I know personally, like, if I do have kids one day, like, I I don't know, like, I want them to have access, like, to have, like, a phone and to have access to the world and the internet and stuff, but, like, I think there's a level of where it can be too much. And I personally, like, I didn't get my first phone until I was, like, 12, and it wasn't even, like, a smartphone, it was, like, one of those, like, phones that, like, slid up and you could, like, text on it, and that was, like, all I could do was, like, text and call. And, I had that until I was, like, probably 15 or 16, and that's when I got my first, like, iPhone, and I used to read all the time. And when I got my first iPhone, my reading, like, went way down because it was, like, Instagram and social media and, like, there's, games on the phone and, like, all kinds of distractions that, like, they can be fun and they can be, good in their own time, but, like, I think it quickly takes over your free time and your spare time, and that's kind of some of my hobbies started to, like, decline a little bit at that time. And so I think that something that's going to be important for me when I have my own kids is trying to find a balance for like, okay, how much access to the internet and phones and things like that, like how much is too much and where is the line on that? Because also like on a moral level, like the internet can be a wonderful place, but it can also be like a terrible, terribly dark place. And a lot of my students just have completely unrestricted access to anything online. And so like one of my students the other day, he was talking about this video, and I guess that there was this thing on TikTok where this kid had a gun or something, and him and his sister were like playing around with it, and she accidentally shot him, and he died. And the video was like going around on TikTok, and one of my students was trying to show another student like this video, and I had to like stop and I was like, please do not show anyone that in my classroom. Like, say I can't control what you do outside of class, but I don't want that coming into this classroom. Like this is, I was like, that's a real person. And she like, I was trying to explain to him, I was like, that is probably the biggest mistake she will ever make in her entire life. I was like, if you had made the biggest mistake you would ever make in your entire life, would you want people to be watching it? Would you want people to be showing their friends? And he was like, well, no, I would never really do that. And I was like, it doesn't matter if you would never do that. If that was you, how would you feel? And he kind of kept avoiding the question and he could, I knew I was getting to him because he kind of was avoiding answering the question a little bit. And I was like, he feels uncomfortable with it now, the idea that this is a real person. And I think sometimes they lose that in this online world where everything is so kind of disconnected a little bit. So that's something that, I mean, if I ever have kids, that would be a huge concern for me, is like how much is too much. And I don't want to be that parent that like restricts everything, like um I don't know, that can make children go the opposite way, I think, and be secretive. And so I think my goal will be to find a balance with my kids, if I ever have kids, is like to have healthy restrictions on age appropriate and not age appropriate things, but also to have an open dialogue with them just in case they come across something that maybe isn't age appropriate, like that they wouldn't be afraid to talk to me about it, so we could maybe have a discussion and they could learn from that. I don't know, it's tough. I'm not a parent, so I don't really know where
Yeah.
that line is. And but I think from seeing my own students in my classroom today, I think that I'm starting to develop a better idea of maybe what I want that line to look like for my own kids one day. So
Hmm. Yeah, you mentioned how that student was finding it really hard to maybe, in some sense, I guess, humanize that whole incident that happened where this person or this kid ended up shooting their own sibling. Um, for you, like now noticing the sort of difference of when you were in their shoes to now where you're on the other side, how important do you think it is for them to understand that aspect of being able to humanize the people that they see online? Because I don't think it was, oh, well, I can't say that I don't think it was a problem, but then we didn't necessarily have much of an issue with probably humanizing those that we saw on the internet because it wasn't as prevalent. But now it's most of what we see, like probably 80% of what we see is what we see online. So, how
mhm.
important do you think it is for them to realize that ability to humanize those that they see online?
I think that that's probably one of the most important things that they can probably learn as they are online, because just the amount of stuff that they kind of bring into the classroom, like the vocabulary they use and things like that, like I can tell that they don't maybe fully consider the implications of the words that they use with each other, or that the way that they talk to each other, or um like to be able to humanize someone else and to kind of put yourself in their shoes. I think that that's something we kind of, even adults today, like it's hard to do sometimes. And I think that that's something you have to constantly be learning throughout your life, is to get better at that, because there's always someone different that you've never encountered before. And so to learn how to put yourselves into someone, you're kind of relearning that experience every time, is like, what kinds of factors in this person's life could I kind of try to imagine for my own life and see maybe how I would feel in that situation. It's just something you constantly have to be vigilant about. And so teaching them to do that, I haven't quite figured out the best way to teach my students how to do that, but I think that it's so important. And I think that it's not something they're getting at home, because I think that there is an age difference between some of my students and their parents obviously aren't on TikTok and they aren't on some of these websites where it's like I think that students are kind of young people now are kind of navigating it on their own a little bit. Um, and so it can be hard when there's no accountability for, you know, them calling someone fat online or cyberbullying. Like if there's not much accountability because there's no one older than them kind of like helping them to see, you know, I, I don't know. It's a tough thing, but I think that that's one of the most important things that I think my students need to learn to be I don't know, to be humane to one another, you know? So I that was kind of a long rambling answer, and I'm not sure where I was trying to end up with that one, but that's just kind of how I feel overall about it. So
Yeah, no, I get where you're coming from because I think it makes it that much harder, right? When especially this is what you've grown up with. Like for us, at
Mhm,
least, we sort of saw that transition happening where, sure, we had social media while we were 10, 12, 13, or whatever, but it's now become, and we've seen it become this thing. So I think we have a bit of an understanding that they probably don't have because that's all they've grown up with, you know? So I
mhm.
sort of see where you're coming from in that sense. And with this sort of, since we've touched upon accountability, I'm just curious what you think about this. Because I mean, like you said, adults still struggle with a lot of these things too, like to be
Mhm.
accountable and understand their own flaws and etc. Like there's a lot of things that we need to figure out ourselves that um we struggle to figure out. So this is maybe just me connecting the dots in some sense, but do you think that it's just, I don't want to say that all of it is just school and their parenting and stuff like that, but I do think that a good chunk of it is. How do you think that that affects adults as we are today? And I personally do think, I'm sorry, I'm going into a bit of a tangent myself too, but um, I do feel like we can change and become more accountable, but then it's a lot harder when you don't see it, right? Like, because if this is all you've seen, it's a lot harder to sort of shift your frame of reference and understand those things. So, firstly, to sort of break these down into questions, firstly, how important do you think it is for us to realize that some of those things that we've grown up with, we still can't change? And why do you think that it is hard for us to change that frame of reference?
Um, hmm. I think that like I'm just talking from my own personal experience, but thinking about like reality and your personal experience, like it's hard to think about things that are outside of what your reality like is. And like for example, um there's this song that I was listening to and it's in French and the it's kind of like a sad song and the artist she wrote it when her mom died and she one of the lines in it is she says that and when I go outside the sun still burns me. And I was thinking about that and I was sitting in the car listening to it with Han and of course he doesn't speak French so he wasn't really understanding it so I was thinking about that line and I thought he would probably never write that kind of line because I asked him I was like have you ever been sunburned and he was like well not really like because like I've been sunburned before, like where you know your skin peels and it's like it hurts and like so I just thought it was interesting to hear a line in a song that like it just made me think about how our own personal, not even our mental experience, but our physical bodily experience affects our perception of events and how we talk about things and how we um and I think we can get so wrapped up in that perception of like how tall I am depends on like how maybe someone else who is quite a bit shorter than me might see the world differently than I see the world, or maybe someone who is disabled and in a wheelchair, like things that I wouldn't notice, like maybe a building isn't accessible to them that I maybe would have never thought about. Like if that's not a part of your everyday experience in your reality, like we often get so focused on like maybe our survival or our own priorities and our own things within our reality that we forget to think about things outside of us. And I don't know if that's just like a human survival tactic that's like hardwired into our DNA, but like um it's just interesting to think about. I think that's one of the most important skills that we can learn. And I think that that maybe is something that separates, like humans, like highly intelligent creatures from, you know, I don't know, I don't want to say like lesser, but like not as intelligent life on Earth. You know what I mean? And I think that the ability to do that, I think, is something that we take for granted and we often forget about. But like, I think it is a gift that we have that we shouldn't take for granted and that we shouldn't forget to exercise. Um, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just where my
It,
mind went.
no, it kind of does, because the angle that I was coming at it from was, there's always this sort of conversation of, this meritocracy versus, I don't know what the opposing term for it is, but where people say that we don't really live in a meritocracy. It's more of an ideal world to say that, yeah, we can live in a meritocracy where those who are performing well will sort of um, be on the top or so on. Maybe you can look at that from a more economic sense now, but like kids, like say, who grow up in more underprivileged families, for them, that's all they know. So for them to be able to grow up and be 21, 22, 23, and realize that what they're doing is wrong is a lot
Mhm,
harder, because that's all they've known. So I
mhm.
think that's where I was coming from. And you sort of explained that too, in terms of it being a lot harder to see that frame of reference. But then we as humans have the ability to see it. So it's something that we need to find a way to figure out.
I
Because
think I think it's I think yeah, like we have the ability, but we have to learn to practice it. It's like I don't know, it's like playing an instrument. Like you can't just pick it up and do it. Like you have to practice it, but we have the ability to like to I don't know. Does that make sense?
yeah, it does. It does. And what you also said about like that sort of hardwiring that we have as humans. I mean, I am quite curious about like evolutionary psychology and stuff like that. And I do think that that does have a role to play, because back in the day, all that was important for humans was to try and survive and not get eaten up by lions and tigers and everything else that roamed around in a forest. They had to make sure that they ate and they fed their kids and their wives. And then they also had to make sure that they survived to live the next day. But now I think the dynamic has changed so much to where we can walk to a Target or a Walmart and get ourselves some chicken, some pork, or whatever people eat. And you don't necessarily have that sense of worry of dying, so to speak, just because an animal decides to make you its meal. So I think it
Mhm,
is that thing that also needs to change, but it's a lot harder to change. And yeah, but we do have the ability to change it for sure, 100%.
mhm,
But yeah, transitioning more into sort of the thing that we were talking about earlier, in terms of talking to students and sort of making them understand certain things. Um, for me, having gone to school in India and more of an Asian influenced society for like high up to high school, it was interesting to sort of notice how there would be moments where teachers would literally take the whole class period to just lecture us on being better. Like, and that I would despise those things. And I mean, back in the day, because I was like, why? Like, I get it now, move on, but I
mhm.
understand where they were coming from. Um, but I felt part of that was also a bit of an extreme. Um, so like, how is that over here? Like, does that happen over here where teachers tend to take the whole class time that they have and just sort of word vomit on how you're not a good kid? Not just, but like to the whole class, I mean,
I
not just to one student, but
I have never seen it happen. I'm sure it does happen. Um, I personally have never seen it happen. And honestly, maybe every once in a while that would, maybe sometimes that would motivate some students. Um, I Yeah, I have never seen that happen. That's interesting. Um, I have taken, like, 5 or 10 minutes to kind of explain things, but, like, past that, it's like there's, like, a lesson to teach, and you have to move on to, like, the next thing, and, like, um, it's like I don't know how school in India works with, like, class periods and stuff, but, like, I mean, I have 6 classes, so it's like, if I were to do that for every class, it's like spent 6 hours that day lecturing my students on being a better student. Like, I don't think I could ever see myself doing that, but I also have never experienced it, so I don't really know, exactly how motivating that is, for individual students, but, um, I mean, some teachers do. I think the way that you talk to your students can make a big difference in how they whether or not they accept or reject what you're saying. Like, for example, there have been other teachers at the school who like, there have been some times where I've, like, gone into their classroom to, like, watch their lesson or stuff, and sometimes I try to always keep a respectful tone with my students, and there have been times that we got frustrated, or, you kinda lose that for a moment, but, like, there have been times when other teachers I'll have seen, like, one teacher, she was like, a student came late to class, and when they come late, they have to print out, like, a tardy slip at the office, and then they have to give it to the teacher before they can come into the classroom. And for her, her rule is that she locks her door, so they have to slide the tardy slip under the door and then knock twice. And then she'll come over when she can and get the tardy slip and open the door. And so this student came and he knocked twice and slid the slip under the door. And she was, like, busy with something, so it was like 30 seconds and she hadn't come down, knocked the door yet. And so he, like, kicked the door, and she, like, opened the door, and she just kind of started yelling at him, and she was like, like, and that you're not supposed to do this, and, like, blah blah blah. And then she was like, 5 more minutes, and she closed the door and locked it again and made him wait another 5 minutes outside. So it was just interesting to, like, personally, like, I would remind the student of the rule, um, but, like, to say, like, "Oh, you know better than this," like, to me, that seems a little condescending in a way. Like, I don't know if I would, depending on the tone. Like, if you could say, like, "Okay, like, I know you can do better than this, like, I know that you have abilities, like, blah, blah, blah." The way that her tone was more like, I don't know, like, "You're being stupid, like, you know better than this, like, you need to," you know? And so the tone, I think, was completely different, and like, I could tell he wasn't as receptive because of the tone that she used with him, and, like, it's kind of embarrassing to have to wait 5 more minutes outside, and then you come into the classroom, and now you're 15 minutes late instead of, you know, 10 minutes late or whatever. So, learning where that line is, and, like, how to speak to students in a way that they are receptive, because sometimes you do need to be strict with them, and you do need to, okay, like, this is serious and you need to get serious about this. But I think that there are ways to do it without being condescending, and do it in a way that kind of maybe helps build the student up or remind them of their value or their worth, and say, you are worth more than this behavior. Like, and I don't know, that's kind of my approach, is to when I try to speak to my students. So I don't know, I mean, if I don't know how you felt whenever your teacher took the whole class period to, like, tell the students they weren't doing well. Do you personally feel like that? How what that approach to speaking to students? Do you think that it was helpful, or do you think that it was unhelpful?
I mean, I can't speak for everybody in my class, but I think it can sometimes fall into deaf ears. Because I now looking back on it, I totally understand where they were coming from, and I can
Mhm,
empathize with it a little more. I can see why they were saying, like, telling us those things, and it came from a good place. It wasn't necessarily them trying to be bad people, but it was just them wanting us to do better, but then they saw that
mhm,
as the way to do it. But
mhm,
yeah, unfortunately, I felt it would fall into deaf ears in most cases, because that wasn't like we'd have that happen, say, in the month of January, and then it would never happen again at all. Like, it would happen again sometime in March or April. Something would come up, and then the same thing happens again, where they take. Maybe I'm exaggerating by saying whole class period, but it would feel that way because it felt like that, because that's how long they would try to take to make us understand. But yeah, it's very interesting, like you said, right? It goes back to how the teacher sort of puts it forward. So for me, now that I try to think about it, I think at most times I just switched off. I didn't necessarily pay attention.
Mhm.
It would make me feel like a shitty person. I'm not going to say that it didn't. Like I would feel like a shitty person sitting there being like, oh,
Mhm.
I'm part of the problem or whatever. It made me feel bad, but it would probably have a momentary impact, like for a day or two. But then after that, it's back to square one. Back to
Mhm.
being a shitty kid in school again. So um I do think that those stern conversations are necessary, but like you said, but it depends on how I think the teachers go about doing it. Because
Mhm.
I was just thinking when you were sort of sharing that story of that teacher sort of yelling at that kid and seemingly being a little condescending, um, would it have been better? Now, this is just a question that I have. Would it have been better if she, say, ended class 5 minutes early, but then called him aside and was like, hey, listen up. What you did was wrong, and like making him explain. Because I think a lot of the times, um, anger is the outlet,
Mhm.
but that's not the best outlet
Mhm.
for kids to understand. Because then when they're being angry, you are trying. I guess we tend to be a little more defensive. So
Mhm.
it's not like we try to understand. I think it's a lot harder to understand someone when they're being very angry, I guess is what I'm
Mhm.
trying to say.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, that just reminded me of one thing that the one of the my neighboring teachers who's in a classroom nearby, she's always like super encouraging to like all the new teachers, and she's been teaching for a while. And one thing that she said to me a couple weeks ago that about classroom management and discipline and things like that that really like stood out to me is like she was saying that like the system often requires compliance. And she said as teachers, we're not necessarily, if we are to be good teachers to give these students the things that they need to be successful, we are not here to teach compliance. We're here to empower the students to make good decisions for themselves. And I thought that was really a great way to look at it rather than just like teaching strict discipline and compliance. Like those are important components, but if it stops there, it's like the students, like you want to teach them how to take responsibility for their learning and their actions and their success. And so um, I would think that, I mean, I know I don't always do this, but I try to maybe when I do talk to students, make sure that I'm talking to them from that lens of
Mm.
how can I empower these students despite the fact that they messed up or they did this wrong or they turned this assignment in late. Like, how can I inspire them to do better next time rather than just like fear the consequences of not? Does that make sense? Like more of a
Yeah.
positive take rather than a negative punitive focus, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. Because now I do think that like where this is mainly the first semester that I moved here. Like I would notice people walking into the classroom 5-10 minutes late, and it would blow my mind that the professors wouldn't like do much. I mean, I know it's college, so
Hmm.
it's a different thing, because I think that in those cases, like personal accountability is at like 90%, and then the teacher trying to teach you to be a better human being is like 10%. Um, so for me, it would blow my mind when kids would walk in like 5-10 minutes late, and that nothing would come out of it.
Hmm.
Um, so it's really like for me to notice that switch was also really interesting, because I think with disciplining as well, like we do have a very warped perspective of what disciplining is, and a lot of the times it seems like it's very confrontational and aggressive and restricting.
Hmm.
Um, but I think it's something that is important, because
Hmm.
there's some things that now I look back and I was like, oh, I'm glad that this was structured this way, because it's made me a certain way and all that. So it's really
Hmm.
interesting, like how different cultures have those influences on how the kids end up
Hmm.
becoming adults and so on. So just out of curiosity, like, are there things that you've noticed in Han in terms of how he like sort of deals with his class situations and things like that when both of y'all were in college, to where it sort of made you wonder, it's interesting, because I don't think an American would do it that way.
Yeah, for sure. There have been, let's see. Well, before like we got together, like I was not as grade focused. I was more like learning focused. Like, okay, am I understanding what I'm learning in classes, and how do I feel about my success in my classes? And it's, I wouldn't get bad grades, but like, to me, a B, a high B or an A, like that doesn't, to me, that there wasn't that much of a difference. For him, he was very focused on getting good grades. And I think claims that it is an Asian culture thing. And I think that maybe he's right from seeing some of my students whose parents come from Asia. Like, I mean, there's a high emphasis on success in education. And so that is something that I kind of learned from him. And it's funny, after we got together, like every semester after that, I got like all A's after that. I was like, because I knew I was like, honestly, like I should not value my self-worth based on my grades. But I looked at my grades and I thought, I can do better than this though. Like I it was interesting to me because I had always thought of it as like I'm not going to let grades define me. But I had also used that, I guess, in a way to kind of as an excuse, maybe to
Mm.
not reach my full potential. And so I think that that was something interesting, that the different perspective on how that works. There all have also been times like where he'll get like, I don't know, like a 92 on a paper or something, and his mom would like message him on Facebook Messenger and be like, "How did you do on this?" And he would tell her, and she would be like irritated that he did not get like 100 on the paper. And like seeing that, I was like, man, like I mean, if I would get an A in school, like my mom, she'd be happy with that. And he claimed, he was like, well, the grading is different in Myanmar, so like the scale of 100, like 92 to 100, like she did not understand the difference, like that there's not that much of a difference because it's by a letter grade rather than. So I just think it's interesting that the different practices and perspectives, and I think on some level it is helpful to have an emphasis on success in education, because I think that that's so important. Um, but I mean, there have been instances where like I think even he has kind of like insinuated this when talking about it. Like sometimes are times when it goes too far, and maybe like for example, one of his cousins, she took their, I guess, version of like the ACT or SAT, like the pre-college like entrance exams, and I guess exam scores are like published publicly there. Like you can look up and find anyone's exam score like publicly. It's not like private. And so when his cousins' exam scores were coming out, like the whole family, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone was like looking to see what her exam scores were, and they weren't very high. And her and her parents, like everyone was trying to call them and talk to them and like stuff, and they disappeared for like 3 weeks because they were so embarrassed, and there was like a level of shame that was like over the top. And his cousin was like messaging Han, and she was like, I don't know what to do. Like, this is like, my parents are not happy with me, and like all this. Like, it was a huge, huge thing. And it's like, I think sometimes it can be taken too far. Like in that instance, like, I mean, I can't imagine how I would feel like if all of my extended family knew my exam scores, and like that would be crazy to me. Like, I
Yeah.
can't imagine, you know, I don't know. So I think it's interesting, the different perspectives, because on one hand, I think that culturally that does inspire better results in school. However, I think it's a balance. I think it's a balance for sure. So I don't know, but I think my students could use some of that at home pressure to do better in school. So
Mm.
I think my students fall on the opposite end of it, where it's not enough. There's not enough at home pressure. So
Yeah, I think like the ideal is usually right in the middle, right? It's in the middle of the
mhm,
extremes. Because yeah, I think again, going back to what you mentioned earlier, right? For you, your grades weren't necessarily part of your identity, but then like for most Asian kids, it is made part of their identity, whether they choose it
mhm,
or not, like
mhm,
with parents paying attention, with relatives paying attention, with relatives you've not spoken to calling you and asking you what your grades were in the final exam, and things like that. Like, it becomes part of you and your parents' identity, to where if you've done really well, you will see them. Because there was this if you do well in some like parts of the country, there's things where they put your picture up on the newspaper, saying, oh, so and so person scored this. It's, in some sense, now that I think about it, it's also like an advertising ploy for those coaching
Mhm.
centers and schools. But then it's also like publicly put out there, being like, hey, look,
Mhm.
this kid did so well. And now if that
Mhm.
kid is your son, you feel this way, to where you start sharing it all around WhatsApp and so on. So when it's great, you get a lot of joy out of it. But when it's the opposite, it's a
Mhm.
lot harder for them to digest, to where now you just
Mhm.
said, I that's a very extreme situation where I haven't necessarily heard of anything like that, but I can see why that would happen.
Uh-huh.
Because the parents have also sort of banked on that being something that they could hold their head up high for, or whatever,
Mhm.
which I think is also kind of weird, because why are you expecting to get happiness from that source? But that's just a whole another conversation, I guess, that people
Yeah.
can have with themselves.
I think that in that situation, it is a little specific to that situation because in Myanmar, where Han is from, like the exam score that you get on this exam determines what you are eligible to study at university.
Right.
So, like, she probably couldn't go into like biology or something like that because of her exam score. So, like, it's like here, even if you score low, you can take remedial classes in college and stuff, and you can still make it work. You just have to be willing to put in the work. There, it's like your options are severely limited by how well you score on the exam. So, I think that there's a lot more pressure on that, which I think Han does not like the education system at home after he has a degree now in education and he's like that education system is not producing great results. But it does put a lot more pressure. So I think that the different ways that the system can work can also influence the way that I don't know. It's like all these different factors of like the system and the culture of the families, and it all comes together to produce maybe a little bit different results. But anyway, I don't know where I was going with that. But
No, I see what you're trying to say, because I think it matters a lot more. Like, there's a lot riding on it in those cases.
Mhm.
Like, if you do well on the exam, like they're putting the sort of parental influence in how they feel, putting that aside, like for the student itself, there's a lot riding on it, because then it's sort of like make or break, or at least that's how they're made to feel, I guess, with the education system. Because it's kind of similar in India too. I remember before having to come here, I had to take a few exams. Well, I chose to take a few exams to see if I could get into college over there. But I was lucky enough to where, while I was making this decision, my parents were supportive of sending me abroad. So it wasn't necessarily like, oh, I wouldn't, it would have to be one or the other. It was more like a flexible thing. Uh,
Mhm.
I remember taking this exam to get into medical school. It used to be called like the AIMPT, like All India Medical, blah, blah, blah. I forget what it's called now. But basically, they have sections where they basically check your aptitude in chemistry, math, physics, and biology. And I did so bad in physics that I scored a zero, because um, I should explain how the name marking works. You get some amount of points for getting the right answer, but then you get docked points for like answering it wrong.
Oh yeah.
So I did so poorly that I ended up getting like a zero on physics and not even a negative score. So again, for me, I was lucky enough to where it wasn't make or break. Like, that decision didn't uh, you know make me feel like it was the end of the road, so to speak. And I mean, I don't think I've said this publicly, but you heard the story's out now. But yeah, that story of me getting a perfect zero, yeah, I don't think I've told that out loud on the internet. But anyway, here we are. But it's interesting how like those things tend to affect people, because I don't think, well, I guess the comparable exam, like you said, is probably the SAT or the ACTs.
Mhm.
it doesn't necessarily feel like it's the end of the world, like you said, because there's options where people can take remedial classes and um, like find their way out to sort of come to that level of um, competency, so to speak,
Hmm.
if they're like to improve their knowledge and understanding of those things. But
Hmm.
anyway, since we've been sort of speaking about like Han and like his sort of the things that you noticed in him in terms of education and things like that, if you're comfortable sharing like this side of your life, what was it like being in a like what was it like for you initially wanting to be in a relationship with a person from the other side of the world?
Hmm. So it's been interesting because when we first like got together, there were like you kind of, I think, underestimate at first some of the cultural differences and how that affects your perspective and your behaviors. And um, so it's something I have learned about as we've gone. We've been together almost 4 years now, and which is crazy. Like time flies, but um, it's there's so much. Like I could talk like all day about like the things that I have learned culturally about myself, even. Um, and not like and about him. And one thing, the biggest thing that I have noticed though culturally is just how individualistic Western culture is. Um, and that's something I didn't even realize. And even as far as like Western culture goes, I think that I am even more maybe independent than what is normal or average. And he is a lot more like family oriented and like I mean, as far as Asian culture goes, I think that he is a little more independent than is normal, but still, from my perspective, he's very much family oriented and group oriented, in that way. And so, when we first got together, we were together for 3 months, and then I spent a semester abroad in France. And doing long distance and trying to figure out that dynamic of like how it just was the most eye-opening experience like about myself is like I just didn't realize until that moment how individualistic I was. Like it's like I would text him in the morning and then I'd go about my day and spend time with friends and stuff, and then like when I get home that evening I would text him again and maybe we'd FaceTime, but like he would get like kind of irritated at me and like, oh, you haven't, I sent you a text 6 hours ago and you never responded. Like it's like, oh, I was busy, I was out with friends and we were cooking dinner and and so it's like it was interesting to learn. At first, my first initial response to it was like, oh, maybe he's a little bit clingy or dependent. And then I realized I was like, no, maybe I am like if I am going to be in a relationship with someone, maybe I am too independent. Like maybe that's something we can adjust on and kind of meet in the middle a little bit because um, I think our first, at least for me, my first initial response to something like that is not to see the flaw in yourself, but see what's different about the other person and perceive that as like a flaw or like, rather than, oh, he actually like is more family and group oriented. Like instead of seeing it that way, seeing it as like, oh, he's too dependent or something. Like that was like a huge mind frame. Like I don't know, my frame of mind just shifted through that process. And I've kind of learned how to be more considerate. And I think that I'm kind of more of an introverted person, and I'm not as like sentimental, and I'm very like our conversation so far about like I don't know the psychology of how we perceive other people and that like those kinds of topics like are topics I could talk about like all day. But I'm not more of like a like romantic like feely person, and so and he a lot more is, and so it's just been so interesting. I think that he humanizes me a little bit more, and I have learned to be more of a human instead of a robot. I think, which is like, I don't know, which is a great thing, and I think that that's a positive thing that's come out of it. Honestly, I don't know where I'm going, but like the differences in perception of how he is and how I am, and how I have learned to kind of accommodate his needs. And I'm still not perfect at it, obviously, but like, and he's learned to accommodate my needs a little bit. It's just interesting, and I think that it can be hard, and I think that it can be For some people, it doesn't work out, and for us, I think that it has, and I feel very fortunate that we have been able to, even though sometimes it has been difficult and it has been hard, we've been able to learn and to grow from it and to grow more together, I guess, rather than to grow apart. And I think that we've been blessed in that way. So I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's beautiful. That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, again, with this next question, you can share what you're comfortable sharing, but if you're not, that's totally fine. You did mention sort of that difficulty and like being able to go past those difficulties and sort of be where you are today. For you, I'm just asking from more of like your personal perspective. We all get these random thoughts of like, oh, maybe I should just put an end to this and not try to pursue it because
Hmm.
I think generally as humans we tend to seek more comfort than discomfort. So you want to be able to avoid conflict in such situations. Excuse me. So how is it for you, like mentally, to be able to understand a little more and like look past some of those differences and sort of or understand them even better? Like, what was that for you? What was that like for you?
Um, a lot of arguments,
Mm,
for sure. There, um, and I would say that as much as I have learned about him, I think that I have learned about myself just as much, if not more. Um, and sometimes it's hard to learn about yourself because you do learn about not only the good things, but also the bad things about yourself, you know? Um, and one thing that I have, well, that process, sometimes it's like in the heat of an argument, you feel like justified and you feel right and stuff. And then like after a couple hours of like thinking about it and considering, it's like, oh wow, like I really, I can actually now I see what he was talking about. Like, why would I say that kind of thing? Or why, what was my motivation for saying this thing? Like, was it just, did I say this just because I wanted to be right? Or did I say this because it was going to help us solve the conflict? And more often than not, I realized, oh wow, I just said that because I like to be right. And
mm,
learning that and learning how to really listen to what the other person is saying and step back and say, okay, my feelings of I feel justified aside, putting that aside for now, how does he see this situation and what is his perspective? Because oftentimes what I see as the conflict and what he sees as the conflict or the problem are different in the situation. It's like for me, I'll focus on this one instance where it's like, this is the thing that hurt the most or that was the biggest problem to me. And for him, it's like way over here. And it's this other thing and so if I'm arguing trying to prove this and he's arguing trying to prove this, it's like we're just talking past each other. So learning how to communicate in a way that we both can understand each other has been has been the biggest thing. And I think that's a part of any relationship. But there's also a cultural element too, like of, maybe I see this as the biggest problem because I am more individualistic or I value these things. And maybe he sees this as the bigger problem because, he grew up this way and his family, they solve problems this way. And in his family, this would be unacceptable to do. And so when you add a cultural element on top of that, it's been a challenge, but it's been such a growth experience, I think, for both of us that um, I don't know. I just am really thankful to have had that experience, and I know that it's not for everyone, but I definitely feel like it was for me, if that makes sense. Um, I
no,
don't know.
that
I
does.
just yeah.
No, that does make sense because I see where you're coming from, and like you said, right, it's part of every relationship to where you sort of have to understand where the other person might be coming from, and maybe rather than trying to be on two separate roads, try to understand why you're on those two separate roads, sort of thing. Because again, like you said, culture is like that added element on top of it.
Mhm,
But generally speaking, we've all grown up a certain way, and that's for us our own, like, I guess, living culture, if you want to put it that way, which is, I guess, in my eyes, slightly different from the culture of the country that you're from and that
mhm.
you're around in terms of your ethnicity and so on. So it's really fascinating how that cultural element also has a role to play in us being able to understand each other, I guess. Because, and again, I think this is more of an opinion, or this is more of a question which is probably going to ask for an opinion more than anything. But do you think that that is one of the major struggles, is people not understanding each other in relationships, that makes it a lot harder for them to maybe get through some of those problems?
I think so. Um, I think you're right about that. And I obviously, my perspective, I see relationships here, the people who are around me, which is a lot of times often like a Western Americanized concept of what a relationship should be and what that looks like. And I think that just seeing my own individualistic kind of perspective, like I think that a lot of times here relationships don't work out because um, I think a lot of times people just prioritize themselves and their own happiness over, like, there are benefits to being in a relationship and being with someone that, like, you have to sacrifice certain things to get those benefits, you know? It is a sacrifice, and I think that sometimes people have a difficult time sacrificing, and sometimes it's justified. Like, sometimes it's like, okay, maybe that relationship is not worth the sacrifice. Maybe your paths are going two different directions and it just is not working out. But in other cases, I think that there are times that people maybe could have made it work if they had been willing to sacrifice their own interests a little bit more for the sake of being together and growing together. Um, and I think that, I don't know, just like a lot of, when I think about my students and like so many of them come from single parent homes and stuff like that, I think that a lot of times people overestimate their ability to make a relationship work.
Mhm.
And because of that, they might make a big investment, like having a kid with someone. And then, oh, a couple of years later, as it turns out, they didn't think that relationship ended up being worth it. And so I think that, like, personally for me, like, if you're at that point of having a kid with someone, it's like there are things that justify it. But I think at that point, it's like your own interests are no longer like preeminent in the whole situation because you have a child, you have, your spouse or whatever. Like, it's like there are so many other people than just you. And I think that's a lot of times culturally here, we look at it as though it's just us, like, oh, am I happy? You know? And so it's like maybe in pursuing your own happiness, you could be causing your child so much unhappiness, or like there are so many different other things to consider. And so that's one thing I think culturally, seeing from Han's perspective and from my perspective, like I think happiness is very important. But in Myanmar, like I think in a lot of Asian cultures as well, it's like your family's, I guess, success or your family's status is something that is more important, and can take place over your own personal happiness. Like you might sacrifice certain elements of your own happiness for the sake of your family. And so I think that finding a balance between the two is is pretty important. I don't know. It's just something I see more now after being in a relationship with him than I used to see. Um, and so that's just my personal like perspective, but I feel like my cultural lens has like shifted a little bit to incorporate more elements of what he perceives, um, which I think is a benefit to me. And that's also, I think, a benefit to him as well. I think we've both grown to, once your perspective kind of expands a little bit, it can benefit you in ways because you can see things that you didn't see before. Um, so I don't know where I was going with that. I feel like I say that a lot. I don't know where I was going with that, but I just kind of like the thoughts that come into my brain. I'm just speaking them out. So
Hey, that's totally fine with me. It's, I think that that's the place where we sort of get to explore more of the sort of thoughts that we have when we go into places where we're not sure where we're going to. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's totally fine by me. You sort of brought it back full circle in some sense about noticing how single parenting and that sort of difference in the way the kids are today in your classroom, to looking at some things that you've noticed from Han's background. Um, and it's really fascinating to sort of look at it from that angle. So, like, to put a bow on this conversation in some sense, um, if there are like three lessons that you've learned from being in a relationship with Han, and some of these things you've probably already talked about, But if you want to like boil them down into like 3 lessons that you've learned, um, what would those 3 lessons be? And yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah, what would those 3 lessons be?
Okay. Um, it's hard to boil it down into. So I'm gonna. Okay, the
I
first
understand.
one I think is learning how. I think that this goes for any relationship, but especially for multicultural relationships, is learning how to like listen to the other person, and that's
Mm,
still something I have to work on all the time. Is learning how to really like not only hear what they're saying, but hear like when they say what they're saying, what are they also like maybe not saying, or like what is the implication of like what is the emotion behind what they're saying, or what is the value or the conflict in what they are saying, like what are they perceiving as the problem? Because sometimes like when you speak and you say things and you focus on certain elements, like it's you don't realize something about what you are saying and about where you're coming from and your own perspective. And so like learning how to hear from someone else when they are speaking, where they're coming from and where their own perspective is, I think that's very important, and that's something that I still struggle with. And it's hard to, I mean, it's hard to kind of hear not only what's being said but what's not being said. I think that that's number one. Number two is for me personally, since I'm just so individualistic, is learning how to work together with someone. Like sometimes like I don't expect support from him in areas that maybe he wants to support me in, or and then vice versa when it comes around to it, like he expects support in an area, and for me it's like if I was in that situation, I would just like do it on my own and do it by myself. And like we to learn that you don't have to, like you can, like we are here to support each other. Um, that is something that I have also learned, is to not just be so individually focused in on like my own problems and stuff. Like we can bother each other with our problems because we're here to support each other. Um, so learning how to kind of rely on someone else, um, that's been kind of difficult, because sometimes it can be easy to rely on him, but like then when he expects it in return, it's like that's not my go-to response. And so to learn how to support someone when they expect you to support them. Um, and then third, hmm, third, I would say to I think thirdly, I have learned maybe, and I think that this is something I still struggle with, but like to learn to not care so much about what other people think or perceive. Um, because like, I don't know, like we're in a relationship that is very unconventional, like multicultural, biracial, like um a homosexual relationship, like, and like he's bisexual and I'm gay, like it's like a whole like we could not be like more different. Um, and like he grew up Buddhist and like I grew up Christian. Like it's like so different and so unconventional that like I often have to like remind myself like because sometimes he'll say things or talk about things with my family. Like there was one time that my brother was asking him about like Buddhism and stuff, and then like for my family, like anyone who's not Christian, like being in a relationship with anyone who's not Christian is like kind of taboo, like you don't do that. And so I got like very uncomfortable, like, and so on the way home I was like kind of irritated, and I was like why, and I had to really evaluate like why was I feeling so irritated about that. And it's like I felt self-conscious about that, and I could see how my family had perceived it. So learning to not take that to heart, and to learning to kind of like, I can exist and be this thing that maybe my family doesn't understand as well, or that my friends or people on Facebook don't might not understand. And if Han says something unconventional or odd or socially inappropriate according to Western values, that doesn't have to be something that I let um, affect how I feel about myself. Like the way that other people perceive me does not have to affect my self worth and my and where I am in life. And I think that that's something I'm still kind of learning, because there are certain topics that I don't really talk about with certain people. Like, I kind of try to compartmentalize, and I think that Han doesn't compartmentalize at all. Like, he'll talk about anything with anyone. And so learning how to kind of decompartmentalize and just be myself in every situation that I go into has been something that's been a lesson that I've been kind of learning, and I'm still learning. It's hard to do, to just have the confidence to be yourself in every situation you go into. It's hard. So,
Cool, cool. I mean, that's beautiful, man. The fact that um, the relationship, and I think I guess this is can be said for all relationships. I mean, I've not been in a romantic relationship, so I don't know, but from what I've heard, like, it helps you learn a lot as a person, and you sharing that also adds to that. So yeah, I mean, this is awesome, man. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you did, Caleb. I really appreciate it. Yeah, like everything from the experiences in school and to now about your relationship with Han. Yeah, I really appreciate you, like, being like willing to go into the depths of some of some of this stuff. And for those of you listening, I do apologize if you're hearing a lot of rumbling from my end. It's because it's windy out here and there's something on the roof, I suppose, that's making a lot of noise. So I apologize if you hear that. But anyway, we're going to transition into the word association game called Bish, Bash, Bosh, where basically I will be giving you 5 different words, and you have to respond to each word one at a time in 3 other words or 3 other phrases. So basically, if I was to say love, what are the 3 things that sort of call out to you when I say the word love? That sort of thing. Love's not the word, but that's just sort of an example. Does that make sense?
mhm.
Cool, cool. And for those of you listening and watching for the first time, I give every guest the same set of 5 words because I like to see how they respond to the same words differently or similarly. So you can also, I'll maybe link the podcast where Han was on and see how he responded similarly or differently to how Caleb did. But yeah, we're gonna go into the first word for the segment, Bish Bash Bosh, which is differences. What are the 3 things that sort of call out to you when you hear the word differences?
um, I hear. I know this, like, word association. I'm supposed to be going quick.
It's
I
okay.
first
Take
of all
your
thought
time.
about cultural differences, and then I thought about um, inequality differences, and then the last one that I think I thought about is um, I don't like my own differences. Like, a lot of times when I go into situations, I feel different than other people, um, and so those are the 3 things I thought about.
Cool. Awesome. What are the 3 things that call out to you when you hear the word nuance?
I hear details, um, like observant, um, um, and I think intentionality, I think, is the last word that I would say. Yeah.
Awesome. What are the 3 things that come to your mind when I say the word learning?
Um, I would say love. I love to learn. Um, I would say um, probably identity, because I think that we learn about our own identity from uh, we as we go through life. And I would say school, because I think about my students and my classroom and the school that I work at. So,
Gotcha. Gotcha. The fourth word is empathy.
I think there's not enough of it in the world today. Um, I think about selflessness. I think that you have to have a level of selflessness to have some empathy. And I think about struggle as well, because I think that oftentimes we learn empathy for others through our own struggles.
Hmm. That's a very interesting take, and which, I mean, yeah, I think um, holds true. Like, we need a lot of it in this world. Anyway, the last word for this segment of Bish Bash Bosh is similarities.
Um, I think ease, I think, is what comes to mind because sometimes it's life is easier if you just surround yourself with people who are exactly like you. But I
Mhm.
also um, I think privilege, and um, I think ease. Hmm, I think there's a concept that's coming to my mind, and I can't think of a word for it. There's a word for it. Um, like complacency. That's the
Mm,
word that's coming to mind.
mm,
Because I think that
mm.
oftentimes when we do experience a lot of ease, we get complacent and relaxed in that, and we forget to grow from that. So,
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, that's a very um, important thing that we need to realize as human beings, I suppose. But yeah, it's a good way to close this segment off. So thank you so much for playing along on this segment of Bish Bash Bosh. Just two more questions before we're done. The first one being, how do you relate to people?
how do I relate to people? I think my instinct in a social situation is to relate to people who can relate to things that I about me, like if we have a similar interest or something. Um, but I think that as I get older, I have learned to when you show genuine interest in things that someone else is interested in, they like if I can feel like I relate to someone if I talk to them about what I'm interested in, but they can feel like they've related to me if I can show interest in what they are interested in. And so balancing those two things, I think is how currently that's how I try to relate to people is to balance not only talking about what I'm interested in, but hearing them and talking, even if it doesn't interest me too much, to like ask them questions and to show genuine curiosity about them. So,
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, the last question is not really a question, but it's more of a request. If there's any parting thoughts that you want to leave us with, or a message that you want to share with those of them listening or watching, whatever it may be, the floor is yours.
um, okay. After every like conversation I have, I always like think back about like, everything I've talked about and mentioned, and like sometimes I kind of like think, oh, maybe I should have said that differently. And what the thing that I kind of want to like readdress and say like I earlier we had talked about how like from an individualistic culture, there are a lot of times when like, and I feel like I came across as disparaging to like single parents and maybe to think about like they thought too much about their own happiness. But I think that there are so many situations where it's not maybe someone's fault that they ended up a single parent. And I think that we should have so much compassion for them and to offer support. And um, so I just want to say that I am sympathetic and I don't want to come across as too harsh, and I'm coming from a place of my own perspective and my own situation. Like I know if I were to have a kid and then end up a single parent, like I know how cautious I am with that kind of thing, and I know that I would do everything I can to avoid that situation. And I know that not everyone has those tools and those resources to be able to do that kind of thing. So I want to end on a note of empathy and to say that sometimes the first thing that comes to our mind or the first thought is from our own perspective, and sometimes it's good to go back and reevaluate that and think, okay, was I empathetic to all parties involved here? Was I seeing all perspectives in this situation? And I think that just constantly being reflective and learning how to reflect on our own opinions, because sometimes sometimes we express a bad opinion, and you need to go back and reevaluate that and think, was that really how I feel about this situation, or was that just my own perspective without considering how I feel when I consider other perspectives? So that's just a lesson that I constantly am having to learn, and I think that that's a big part of life, is just learning how to go back and reflect on who we are, where our perspective is, and how we can be more empathetic on others. And I think um, personally, I think that the world would be a much better place if we practice that. So that's something I aspire to practice, but I'm not always good at. And so that's kind of where I want to end. So
Cool. Hey, totally. I get what you're saying, because a lot of times when we say things, they come from our personal perspective, and they're not necessarily. It's not wrong to do that, but then I think
Mhm,
not. We also need to realize that our perspective is not the world's perspective, and that there's a lot more
mhm,
to it than just what we
mhm.
believe in. So yeah, that's a great note to close off on. Thank you so much, Caleb, for sharing everything that you did. I really
Thank you for having
appreciate
me on. Yeah,
you. Yeah, totally. I appreciate you, like I said earlier, going into the depth of all of these things. So thank you.
awesome. Yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation. It went by so fast. I really enjoyed it. So yeah,
Yeah,
awesome.
I'm glad. So thank you. And for those of you listening and watching, thank you so much. And we'll see you guys next time.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye.